Let go of the bread.
The kitchen door slammed inward as two starving men crashed across the threshold, each gripping one end of the last loaf of bread. Joanna Bell caught the flour table before it overturned and saw the others outside, thin farmhands, exhausted widows, and gray-faced laborers from both estates, watching that loaf as if it were the final hour of their lives. One woman held an empty tin plate against her chest, too ashamed to ask again. Neither village had eaten a full meal in 3 days. "Let go," Joanna said. Neither man obeyed. Gideon Pike wore the green armband of Hawthorne Estate. Matthew Rusk had the red neckcloth of Blackmere. Their families had despised each other longer than either man could remember. Now hunger had reduced that proud inheritance to 4 hands crushing a loaf between them. Beyond the boundary fence, armed riders from both estates were already gathering. They had not come to share supplies. Each landowner had sent men to make certain the other side took nothing from the abandoned kitchen. But somebody had been inside before Joanna arrived. Fresh boot marks crossed the dust near the sealed storeroom, and one heavy wagon track disappeared toward the northern ridge, the same ridge both landowners claimed held nothing but dead pasture. What had been carried out of that kitchen before the hungry reached it? Joanna stepped between Gideon and Matthew. She was a slender woman in a faded black dress, with wrists narrow enough to look breakable and a stillness that made stronger people reconsider themselves. She placed both hands over the torn loaf. "You pull again," she said, "and nobody eats." Matthew's jaw tightened. That grain came from Blackmere. "The wood that baked it came from Hawthorne," Gideon answered. "And the hands that kneaded it belong to me," Joanna said. "So unless either of you plans to eat my hands, you will stand back." For one breath, no one moved. Then Joanna broke the loaf cleanly, not into 2 pieces, but into 12 thin portions. She carried them outside and gave the first to the weakest woman, then divided the rest among those who looked least able to survive another night. Gideon and Matthew received nothing. That may sound cruel, but hunger has a way of revealing whether mercy is merely a pleasant word or a discipline. Joanna knew that feeding the strongest first would only teach them to fight harder tomorrow. The abandoned kitchen stood exactly where the 2 estates refused to agree the boundary lay. Its stone ovens belonged to neither side according to one map, and to both sides according to another. The roof sagged, the chimney leaned, half the windows were boarded over. Yet its ovens were wide enough to bake bread for both villages. If Hawthorne provided grain, if Blackmere provided fuel, and if hatred could be kept outside long enough for dough to rise. Joanna turned toward the gathered adults. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "Hawthorne brings flour. Blackmere brings firewood. Both villages bring workers." A bitter laugh came from the road. Sir Alistair Hawthorne sat on a dark horse, straight-backed and silver-haired, with 6 armed men behind him. Across the fence, Lord Edmund Blackmere approached with his own riders. Neither man looked at the starving people first. They looked at each other. "You have no authority here," Hawthorne called. "On that point," Blackmere said coldly, "we agree." Joanna held up the empty bread cloth. "Then agree on this. By tomorrow night, people on both your lands will begin dying." Neither landowner answered. From inside the kitchen came a dull knock. Joanna turned. The sealed storeroom door trembled once, though no wind moved through the room. Then something slid from beneath it, a single grain of wheat, followed by another. She knelt and pressed her fingers to the floorboards. The room beyond that locked door was not empty. And as the 2 landowners ordered their men forward, Joanna realized the last loaf had never truly been the last. Joanna rose before either landowner could reach the threshold and planted herself between their riders and the locked storeroom. "No weapons inside," she said. Sir Alistair Hawthorne looked down at her from the saddle. "Stand aside, Mrs. Bell." Lord Edmund Blackmere dismounted first, though not out of courtesy. He crossed the yard with one gloved hand resting near the pistol beneath his coat. "That room is Blackmere property," he said. Hawthorne swung down from his horse. The western wall stands on my ground. The western wall has leaned east for 20 years. Stone does not change a survey. Neither does your shouting, Joanna said. The two men turned toward her with the same offended expression. And for the first time that morning, they looked less like enemies than brothers raised badly. Joanna took the iron key she had been given with the kitchen and pushed it into the lock. It would not turn. Gideon came to the doorway. Matthew stood behind him. Neither crossed the threshold while armed men waited outside. But both stared at the wheat scattered beneath the door. "That grain is ours," Gideon said. Matthew answered, "You have not grown enough grain to fill a hat. And Blackmere has not cut enough wood to warm a grave." Joanna gripped the key again. "Then it appears both of you have arrived with nothing but insults." She sent Matthew for lamp oil and Gideon for a hammer and chisel. They hesitated, each unwilling to obey, while the other watched. Joanna looked past them to the hungry adults gathered near the fence. "Choose," she said. "You may defend your pride, or you may help me open a door." They went. The lock had been packed with hardened grease and metal filings, as if someone wanted it to appear merely rusted. Joanna worked the chisel along the plate while Gideon held the lamp. Matthew struck carefully with the hammer. The men stood so close their shoulders touched, yet neither acknowledged it. When the lock finally broke, the door opened only 6 inches before something heavy stopped it. Joanna slipped sideways through the gap. The storeroom smelled of old flour, damp rope, and mice. 3 torn grain sacks lay against the wall, but they contained less than a bushel between them. The wheat beneath the door had spilled from one of those sacks. Behind the door stood an empty handcart. Fresh mud clung to its wheels. Joanna lifted the lamp. Scrape marks ran from the shelves to the floor, then toward a narrow rear passage hidden behind stacked crates. The passage ended at an outer loading door whose bolt had recently been cut. Sir Alistair entered behind her. "You see," he said, "Blackmere thieves stripped it." Edmund forced his way through the doorway. "Your men had possession of this kitchen last winter." Joanna crouched near the wheel track. A strand of coarse red wool had caught on a nail in the handcart. Red was Blackmere's color, but the thread had been tied there deliberately. The knot was too neat, and the cloth had never dragged through mud. Someone had left it to be found. She pulled it free and folded it into her palm. "What did you find?" Edmund asked. "A reason not to accuse anyone yet." Hawthorne gave a humorless smile. "That is widow's caution. Land cannot be managed by caution." "No," Joanna said. "It is usually ruined by men who mistake accusation for proof." She returned to the main kitchen and began taking inventory. One oven had a cracked stone, but 2 remained sound. The well pump worked after Gideon cleared grit from the pipe. Blackmere's workers found dry kindling under a collapsed lean-to. Hawthorne's people discovered 4 barrels of coarse flour in a tenant storehouse, too little to feed their village for more than several days. Blackmere had timber and charcoal, but almost no grain. Hawthorne had grain, but his lower woods had been flooded, and his remaining fuel would not last through the cold nights ahead. Neither estate possessed enough to survive alone. Joanna wrote the numbers on the kitchen wall with a piece of charcoal. She did not use the names Hawthorne and Blackmere. She wrote only what existed. Flour, 4 barrels. Rye, half a sack. Fuel, 12 wagon loads. Salt, 2 crocks. Able workers, 37. People needing daily bread, 109. The room went quiet as the last number appeared. Hawthorne stared at it. "That figure is exaggerated." "It is incomplete," Joanna said. "Several outlying farms have not been counted." Edmund folded his arms. "Blackmere will not place its fuel under Hawthorne control." "Then do not." Hawthorne frowned. "And my grain will not be carried on a Blackmere land." "Then it need not be." Joanna tapped the stone floor beneath them. "This kitchen stands on the line neither of you can prove." Grain enters through the west door. Fuel enters through the east. Nothing is surrendered to the other estate. Everything is measured here, baked here, and distributed from here. And who controls the count? Edmund asked. No one landowner. She divided the wall into 2 columns. One would record every sack brought in. The other would record every loaf carried out. A worker from Hawthorne would witness the fuel. A worker from Blackmere would witness the grain. Joanna would keep the central ledger, but every number would remain visible on the wall. Gideon studied the columns, and when one side lies, the other side writes it down. Matthew gave the first faint smile anyone had seen that morning. That might require a second wall. Joanna ignored the laughter, but she did not stop it. By noon, the abandoned kitchen sounded alive. Axes split old shelving into ovenwood. Men carried water. Women scrubbed kneading boards with boiled brine. Gideon and Matthew repaired the broken loading door together because neither trusted the other to do it alone. Joanna chose 3 workers from each estate to measure rations. She assigned no one to handle supplies from their own side. Hawthorne workers weighed Blackmere fuel. Blackmere workers weighed Hawthorne flour. Distrust properly arranged could serve honesty. The first dough was thin and dark, mixed with rye and crushed beans to stretch the flour. Joanna added salt carefully. She showed the workers how to make smaller loaves so no household could hide excess beneath a coat. When a Blackmere woman slipped half a cup of flour into her sleeve, Gideon saw her. His face hardened. Joanna stepped between them before he could speak. "How many mouths in your cottage?" she asked. 3 adults, the woman whispered. "One is too sick to come." Joanna took the flour from her sleeve, added it back to the bin, then marked an extra ration for the sick adult. "No stealing," she said. "No punishment for telling the truth." The woman nodded and returned to the kneading table. Gideon watched her go. Hawthorne would have dismissed her. Blackmere would have done worse, Matthew said. Joanna looked at both men. That is why neither estate will judge inside this kitchen. The first batch went into the ovens before sunset. The smell of baking bread drifted across the disputed fence, and people from both villages began arriving with tin plates, cloth sacks, and guarded faces. Hawthorne folk stood to the west. Blackmere folk stood to the east. No one crossed the center line Joanna had drawn in chalk. When the oven doors opened, the crowd pressed forward. Joanna raised one hand. Names first, portion second, no estate before another. Hawthorne's steward, Silas Vane, stepped from behind Sir Alistair's riders. He was a narrow man with a clean coat and a voice too calm for hungry ground. "You are creating confusion," he said. "Hawthorne tenants must be served from Hawthorne stores." "Then Hawthorne tenants may eat raw flour," Joanna replied. "The ovens require Blackmere fuel." Vane's eyes moved toward the charcoal ledger on the wall. "You have no authority to publish estate inventories." "I have authority over this kitchen." "Granted by whom?" Joanna looked toward Sir Alistair. For a moment he said nothing. The crowd noticed. Then Hawthorne spoke with visible reluctance. "She has use of the building." "Use is not command," Vane said. Edmund Blackmere stepped closer. "Nor does Hawthorne's steward command on disputed ground." Vane turned to him. "Your lordship may regret defending her." "I am not defending her. I am contradicting you." Joanna began distributing bread before either man could reclaim the moment. The first loaf went west. The second went east. The third was split between 2 workers who had repaired the oven stone together. By nightfall, every person in line had received something. It was not enough to satisfy hunger, but it was enough to prevent panic. The chalk boundary remained on the floor, yet feet had crossed it all evening without violence. After the crowd left, Joanna counted what remained. 2 little flour. More fuel than the books predicted. And 1 missing entry. A wagon of Hawthorne grain had been recorded at the estate storehouse that morning, but it had never reached the kitchen. Gideon swore he had seen it loaded. Matthew swore no Blackmere Road Patrol had stopped it. Joanna checked the wheels of the empty handcart in the storeroom again. The mud on them was pale and chalky, unlike the dark soil around the boundary kitchen. Only the northern ridge had ground that color. She opened her palm and studied the red wool thread she had taken from the nail. Then a shadow crossed the boarded window. Joanna moved toward the rear door, but Silas Vane was already standing outside. His coat was buttoned against the night, and behind him waited a covered wagon. Its wheels were coated in pale chalk. "You have done enough for one day," he said. Joanna looked at the sagging canvas. Something heavy shifted beneath it. "Where is that wagon going?" Vane smiled without warmth. "Back where no hungry fool can turn it into a war." Joanna stepped into the yard before Silas Vane could signal the driver. The covered wagon stood between the kitchen and the northern road. Its rear axle bowed beneath the load. Pale chalk dust clung to the wheels. The same dust she had found on the handcart hidden behind the storeroom door. "Pull back the canvas," she said. Vane's expression did not change. "You have mistaken temporary usefulness for rank." "No, I have mistaken a stolen wagon for evidence." At that word, the kitchen workers began appearing behind her. Gideon came first, carrying no weapon. Matthew followed with the iron poker he had been using to clear ash, though he kept it lowered. 6 more adults gathered at the doorway, divided by clothing, custom, and old resentment, but united by hunger. Vane glanced towards Sir Alistair Hawthorne. The landowner remained beside his horse. "Explain the wagon, Silas." "It contains estate stores moved for safekeeping." "From whom?" Joanna asked. "From disorder." Lord Edmund Blackmere walked around the wagon slowly. "You mean from the people who grew the grain?" Vane's gaze hardened. "Blackmere has no standing in Hawthorne accounts. Yet Hawthorne grain is being hauled across disputed ground after dark." Joanna reached for the canvas rope. The driver raised a whip. Matthew moved in front of her. Gideon stepped beside him. Neither man spoke. Their presence was enough. Vane lifted one hand, and the driver lowered the whip. Joanna untied the rope. Under the canvas lay 8 full sacks of wheat, 2 barrels of oats, and sealed tins of cooking fat. It was more food than had entered the boundary kitchen all day. Painted on each sack was the Hawthorne Mill mark. Beneath that mark, someone had brushed a black line through the inventory number. The hungry workers did not shout. Their silence was worse. Gideon looked towards Sir Alistair. "We were told the North Granary spoiled." Hawthorne's face tightened. "That was the report I received." "From him?" Joanna asked. Vane answered before his master could. The northern store was compromised by damp. What remained was separated to preserve seed stock. "Then why move it after midnight?" Edmund said. "To prevent theft." Matthew gave a dry laugh. "By thieves." Vane ignored him. "If this grain is distributed now, Hawthorne will have nothing to plant in spring. Mrs. Bell is feeding tonight by stealing next year." That argument struck where hunger had made everyone afraid. Gideon looked at the sacks, then at the empty kitchen bins. Even Joanna hesitated. Seed grain was not merely food kept back by a cruel man. It was the next harvest, the difference between one hard season and 2. Vane saw the doubt pass through the yard. "You may open every sack," he said. "You will find clean wheat. You may also condemn both estates to permanent dependence because a widow with a chalkboard wished to appear merciful." Joanna took one grain from a torn seam and pressed it beneath her thumbnail. It split easily. She brought it to the lantern. The kernel had been milled smooth at one end. "This is not seed grain," she said. Vane's voice remained calm. "You cannot know that from one kernel." "No, but I can know it from this." She reached into the sack and pulled out a wooden scoop buried beneath the wheat. Fine flour dust coated its handle. Seed sacks were filled at the granary. This sack had been refilled beside a millstone. Gideon opened another. Beneath the top layer of wheat lay dried beans and cracked rye. Food grain. Bakery grain, enough to stretch meals for days. Joanna faced Sir Alistair. Your steward was not preserving seed. He was hiding provisions. Hawthorne looked older beneath the lantern light. Why? Vane turned toward him with practiced patience. Because once Blackmere learned Hawthorne retained stores, they would seize them. Edmund stepped forward. You have accused my estate of theft without proof. I have kept Hawthorne alive while you burned fence posts to heat your tenants' cottages. We cut our own fences. Near the boundary, ownership is a matter of opinion. Joanna understood then that Vane did not need the estates to fight over the grain. He needed them to remain afraid enough that no one questioned his control of it. She climbed onto the wagon bed and looked over the gathered workers. This food will not be divided tonight. Murmurs rose immediately. Vane almost smiled. Joanna continued. It will be entered on the wall. Every sack, every barrel. Hawthorne will retain the seed stock already sealed at its south granary. This food will be used for bread, with Blackmere fuel and labor from both villages. You cannot compel Hawthorne property into common use, Vane said. No, Joanna replied. Sir Alistair must choose. Every face turned toward the landowner. He had spent years refusing any gesture that might be called surrender to Blackmere. Now his steward had placed him before his own starving workers and forced him to admit either ignorance or consent. Sir Alistair looked at Gideon. How many Hawthorne households receive bread today? 41. How many would have received none without Blackmere fuel? All of them. Hawthorne turned to Joanna. Record the wagon. Vane's composure cracked for the first time. Sir, record it. Joanna did not celebrate. She handed Gideon the chalk and asked Matthew to witness the count. That mattered more than victory. By morning, the kitchen wall carried the truth in numbers large enough for any worker to read. Hawthorne had hidden food. Blackmere had more fuel than its steward had admitted. Both estates had lost crops. Both had exaggerated the other side's strength while concealing their own weakness. Joanna created barter tokens from thin squares of scrap wood. 1 mark represented an hour of labor. 2 marks earned a household ration. Adults unable to lift sacks could clean grain, mend cloth, keep the ovens, or copy the public ledger. No token carried an estate crest. Only a loaf stamp burned into the wood. The system angered both landowners equally, which Joanna took as evidence that it might be fair. For 3 days, the kitchen held. Hawthorne wagons entered from the west. Blackmere fuel carts entered from the east. Workers who once would not drink from the same bucket now stood at opposite ends of the same kneading table. Gideon learned Matthew could judge oven heat by placing his palm near the stone. Matthew learned Gideon could repair a flour scale with wire and patience. They did not become friends. They became useful to one another. That was harder to undo. On the 4th evening, an older Blackmere tenant named Ruth Vale approached Joanna after distribution. She had worked in Edmund's accounts room before poor eyesight cost her the position. In one hand, she carried a folded inventory slip. I copied this before they dismissed me, Ruth said. I thought it was an error. The paper listed emergency reserves stored at a neutral hunting lodge on the northern ridge. Grain, salt pork, dried apples, lamp oil. Enough, perhaps, to support both communities for several weeks. At the bottom were 2 signatures. One belonged to Silas Vane. The other belonged to Blackmere's chief agent, Corwin Ash. Joanna read the names twice. The secret stockpile was not one estate stealing from the other. The 2 agents had been hiding food together. Ruth lowered her voice. They bought it with emergency levies collected from both villages after last year's drought. Do the landowners know? I cannot prove they do not. That was the cruelest part. Joanna had evidence of the hoard, but not yet of who had ordered it concealed. If she exposed it carelessly, Hawthorne would accuse Blackmere. Blackmere would accuse Hawthorne. The alliance would collapse before the ridge stores reached the ovens. A horse stopped outside. The room fell quiet. Corwin Ash entered through the east door wearing a dark wool coat and polished boots. He was broader than Vane, with a courteous voice and the patient manner of a man accustomed to making threats sound administrative. Behind him stood 2 armed deputies from the county seat. "Mrs. Bell," he said, "you have created an unauthorized market on disputed property." Joanna folded Ruth's paper inside her sleeve. "I have created bread. You have issued tokens without county approval, transferred private goods, and encouraged laborers to disregard lawful estate authority. They worked for food. They worked under your mark." Ash placed a sealed document on the flower table. "By morning, this building will be closed. All supplies will return to their legal owners. Anyone resisting will be charged with theft." Edmund Blackmere entered behind him. "You requested deputies without consulting me." Ash bowed slightly. "Your lordship's hesitation required protection." Sir Alistair appeared at the west doorway. Vane stood just behind him. For one suspended moment, both landowners faced their own agents across Joanna's table. Vane spoke softly. "The experiment has gone far enough." Joanna moved to the center of the threshold, Ruth's evidence hidden against her wrist. "No one under this roof will be arrested for baking bread." Ash looked at the workers crowding behind her. "Step aside, Mrs. Bell." She did not. Gideon and Matthew came forward and stood on either side of her. Then Ruth joined them, one by one. Adults from both estates crossed the chalk line until the doorway held no Hawthorne side and no Blackmere side. Only hungry people who had learned exactly what cooperation tasted like. Ash rested one hand on the closure order. "You cannot feed 2 villages with defiance." "No," Joanna said, "but we may feed them with what you hid on the northern ridge." Vane's head turned sharply. Ash did not move at all. That told Joanna the paper was true. Behind her, fear passed through the workers. Some had heard stories of the Ridge Lodge. Others understood at once that the emergency levies had purchased food they had been denied. Yet Joanna did not display Ruth's inventory. Not yet. She looked first at Sir Alistair, then at Edmund. "If I read the names on this record aloud, your people will tear that ridge apart before sunrise. They may find food. They may also find armed guards, locked stores, and enough old hatred to start killing." Edmund's voice was low. "What are you asking?" "1 joint inspection. Both landowners. 6 unarmed witnesses. 3 from each estate. We open the lodge together and bring every usable ration here under public count." Hawthorne stared at Ash. "Is there food on my ridge?" Ash answered carefully. "There are reserves whose ownership remains under review." "There is your answer," Joanna said. Vane stepped towards Sir Alistair. "If you enter that lodge beside Blackmere, you acknowledge his claim to the ridge." Edmund gave a cold smile. "And if I enter beside Hawthorne, I acknowledge his." Joanna looked between them. "Then enter beside the hungry." Neither man replied. Outside, a rifle cracked from the direction of the northern road. A second shot followed. Then a riderless horse came galloping into the yard, dragging a broken harness strap. Tied to the saddle was one of Joanna's wooden bread tokens. Someone at the ridge already knew they were coming, and whoever guarded the hidden food was prepared to destroy the alliance before dawn. The northern lodge caught fire before Joanna's party reached the first gate. Flames climbed through the roof shingles, bright against the pre-dawn sky. 2 wagons stood near the loading shed, already packed beneath dark canvas. Armed guards shouted as they cut the lead teams loose, and one driver whipped his horses toward the eastern trail. "They are moving the stores," Gideon said. "They are burning what they cannot move," Matthew answered. Joanna had brought exactly what she promised. Sir Alistair, Lord Edmund, 3 witnesses from Hawthorne, 3 from Blackmere, and no armed escort. But Hawthorne and Edmund had each carried a pistol beneath his coat, and both men reached for them at the same moment. Joanna stepped between them and the gate. Those guns will make every man up there choose a side. The lodge is on my land, Hawthorne said. Edmund's face was hard in the firelight. That is what your maps claim. And that argument is what Vane and Ash are counting on, Joanna replied. Put them away. Another shot struck the gatepost beside her shoulder. The witnesses scattered behind the stone wall. Joanna did not duck until Matthew pulled her down. A second bullet passed above them and buried itself in a pine trunk. So much for an unarmed inspection, Edmund said. A wagon thundered from the compound. Its driver bent low, aiming for the road between the two estate owners. Gideon seized a loose gate chain and ran across the track. Matthew caught the other end. They pulled together. The chain rose just as the lead horses reached it. The driver tried to turn. The wagon wheel struck a drainage rut, climbed halfway out, then collapsed. Sacks split across the road. Wheat poured into the mud. The guards at the lodge abandoned the burning shed and ran toward the wreck. Joanna saw what they did not. The second wagon was slipping away through the rear orchard. Edmund, she said, where does that trail lead? To the old bridge. Hawthorne. It crosses the boundary twice before reaching the county road. That was why the agents had chosen it. If Hawthorne pursued across Blackmere ground, or Blackmere crossed Hawthorne land, each could claim invasion. One pistol shot between their men would restore the feud before the hidden grain ever reached a public scale. Joanna took the riderless horse they had recovered at the kitchen. The animal shied at the flames, but she caught the reins close and mounted. Open the lodge, she told Gideon. Save the records first. Food second. Where are you going? Matthew asked. To keep the other wagon from disappearing. Edmund caught her bridle. You cannot stop armed men alone. Then ride with me. He looked at Hawthorne. The older man was already mounting. For the first time in 20 years, the two landowners rode in the same direction without chasing one another. The rear trail narrowed between limestone banks. Joanna followed the wheel marks while smoke drifted over the ridge. Ahead, the wagon struck the bridge planks hard enough to shake the railings. Corwin Ash rode beside it. Silas Vane followed behind. They had not trusted hired guards with the most important cargo. Joanna's horse gained on them near the center span. The old bridge crossed a deep wash cut by spring floods. Half its northern railing had rotted away. Ash looked back and drew his pistol. Edmund reached beneath his coat. No, Joanna shouted. Ash fired first. The bullet struck Joanna's saddle horn and tore through the leather. Her horse reared. She slipped sideways, one boot catching in the stirrup, and for a terrible moment the ground spun beneath her. Hawthorne seized her coat and hauled her upright. Edmund rode ahead, but he did not draw his weapon. He pushed his horse against the wagon team and forced the lead animals away from the broken railing. Vane climbed onto the wagon seat and slashed at Edmund with the long end of a driving whip. The horses panicked. The wagon swerved. One rear wheel broke through a rotten bridge plank and dropped to the axle. The entire load leaned toward the ravine. Ash jumped clear. Vane fell against the brake lever, gripping it with both hands. Joanna dismounted and moved toward the wagon. Do not come closer, Vane said. His face had lost all polish. Firelight pulsed behind them, and sweat ran beneath his collar despite the cold morning. The canvas covers grain, Joanna said. Let the horses go. Vane looked down at the ravine. Then he looked at the three people approaching him. One widow and two landowners whose hatred had made his theft possible. You think this ends with bread? He asked. By winter's end, both estates will be bankrupt. The banks will take the land. Your grateful tenants will scatter before spring. Ash had risen near the bridge entrance. He aimed his pistol at Joanna. Edmund saw him. This time he drew. Hawthorne drew too. The two landowners stood on opposite ends of the bridge, weapons trained across Joanna's body. It was the moment Vane and Ash had spent years creating. Joanna lifted both hands. If either of you fires, they win. Ash smiled. She is correct. Hawthorne sees a Blackmere pistol. Blackmere sees a Hawthorne pistol. By noon, no witness will remember who shot first. Edmund's arm trembled with anger. Hawthorne's did not tremble at all. Joanna walked toward the wagon. Lower your weapons. Neither obeyed. She placed herself directly between them. Sir Alistair, the grain in that wagon was bought with Blackmere money as well as yours. Lord Edmund, Hawthorne labor filled those sacks. Neither of you can save it alone. The wagon shifted. Wood cracked beneath the rear wheel. Vane clung to the brake. Joanna reached the horses and cut the traces with a knife from the driver's bench. The animals stumbled free and ran towards solid ground. The sudden release tipped the wagon farther. Vane cried out as the brake lever tore loose. Hawthorne holstered his pistol first. He ran to the rear axle. Edmund lowered his weapon one heartbeat later and joined him. Together they braced their shoulders beneath the leaning wagon while Joanna pulled Vane from the seat. Matthew and Gideon arrived with rope from the lodge. They tied it around the front frame, and every witness took hold. Hawthorne people pulled beside Blackmere people. The wagon rose an inch. Then two. The broken will cleared the hole. Ash tried to escape on foot. Ruth Vale stood at the far end of the bridge, holding the county deputy's own rifle across her arms. She did not aim it. She did not need to. The deputies ran when the lodge caught, she said. I did not. Ash stopped. By sunrise, the Ridge stores had been opened under joint witness. The main granary held 43 sacks of wheat, 16 of rye, 8 barrels of salted meat, dried apples, lamp oil, and tools purchased with emergency levies from both estates. The fire destroyed one shed, but Gideon and Matthew carried the account books out before the roof fell. Inside the strongest ledger, every hidden purchase had been recorded. Beside each entry appeared 2 sets of initials. SV. CA. Yet the final pages carried something worse. Planned sales to a regional grain broker at winter prices. Vane and Ash had intended to let hunger deepen, sell the reserve at a profit, then offer loans against farms desperate enough to sign anything. The agents had not wanted Hawthorne to defeat Blackmere or Blackmere to defeat Hawthorne. They wanted both estates weak enough to control. The county hearing began 2 days later in a packed courthouse. Wooden benches filled before noon. Hawthorne workers sat on one side, Blackmere workers on the other, though several kitchen workers ignored the division and stood together along the rear wall. Joanna sat at the front table with the public kitchen ledger, Ruth's copied inventory, and the scorched books from the lodge. Silas Vane and Corwin Ash sat behind an attorney from the county seat. Both wore clean coats. Neither looked toward the hungry adults whose levies had purchased the hidden food. Judge Mercer entered beneath a faded territorial seal and called the room to order. The agent's attorney spoke first. He did not deny the existence of the reserve. He called it prudent estate management. He said Vane and Ash had protected supplies from mob seizure, spoilage, and unlawful interference. He described Joanna's bakery as an unauthorized exchange that had erased property lines, issued false currency, and placed private assets under the control of a woman with no estate office. Then he placed the closure order before the judge. The county seal was genuine. The deputies' signatures were genuine. The order had been filed before Joanna confronted Ash at the kitchen. For the first hour, official paper appeared stronger than hunger. Judge Mercer examined Joanna's wooden bread tokens. You paid labor with these? I recorded labor with them. They were exchanged for food. Yes, sir. Without a license? Hungry people repaired ovens. I fed them from supplies placed under public count. The attorney rose. Supplies belonging to 2 private estates. Supplies purchased partly through levies charged to the workers, Joanna said. Do you possess contracts granting those workers ownership? No. then your moral argument is not a legal one. The courtroom shifted uneasily. Joanna looked toward Ruth. Ruth held the copied inventory with both hands, but her courage had begun to fade. The attorney called Sir Alistair Hawthorne. Hawthorne admitted that Silas Vane had brought authority to move grain and preserve seed. He admitted he had not reviewed every account. He admitted the northern ridge was disputed. Edmund's testimony did little better. Corwin Ash had also been authorized to collect emergency levies and secure Blackmere provisions. No written order required those stores to be distributed during a shortage. The agents had acted cruelly. Cruelty alone was not the charge. The charge was theft, fraud, and conspiracy. Then the attorney introduced the lodge ledger. Joanna expected it to condemn the agents. Instead, he opened to the signed authorization page. At the bottom were the names of both landowners: Alistair Hawthorne, Edmund Blackmere. The courtroom erupted. Judge Mercer struck his gavel. Hawthorne stared at the page. "I never signed that." "Nor did I," Edmund said. The attorney carried the book to the bench. Both signatures were witnessed by his state officers. The reserve was jointly authorized. My clients merely carried out instructions the landowners now find embarrassing. Vane looked almost sorrowful. Ash looked relieved. For the first time since the kitchen opened, Joanna felt the alliance slipping beyond her reach. Hawthorne workers began accusing Blackmere. Blackmere voices answered. One man near the rear shouted that the ridge had always belonged to Hawthorne. Another called the bakery a trick to steal fuel. Judge Mercer ordered silence and warned that he would clear the room. The attorney turned toward Joanna. "You accuse my clients publicly. You led men onto disputed property. You interfered with a lawful transport and nearly caused a fatal bridge collapse. Yet the owner's signatures prove the reserve was authorized." He placed the ledger before her. "Do you still claim this book proves fraud?" Joanna looked at the signatures. The handwriting resembled both men's names. The ink had aged evenly. The page carried the lodge seal. For one cold moment, she had no answer. The judge leaned forward. "Mrs. Bell." Behind her, a bench creaked. Ruth Vale stood. Her face had gone pale. Ash turned his head slightly and looked at her. He said nothing, but Ruth saw the warning in his eyes. He had dismissed her once. He could still discredit her. An older accounts clerk with failing sight against two respected estate agents and a sealed book. She nearly sat down again. Then Matthew placed one of Joanna's wooden bread tokens on the rail before her. Ruth touched the burned loaf mark with one finger. "I copied the inventory," she said, though her voice failed on the last word. The attorney sighed. The witness has already admitted her eyesight is poor. Ruth looked at Joanna, then at the adults from both estates who had worked beside her in the kitchen. "My distant sight is poor," she said. "My close work remains exact." Judge Mercer allowed her forward. Ruth examined the authorization page beneath the oil lamp. She did not study the signatures first. She studied the numbers written above them. "These entries are false." The attorney objected. The judge asked why. Ruth pointed to the dates. The reserve was supposedly approved on March 3rd. The purchase entries beneath it are dated March 1st and 2nd. That proves only that purchases began before final authorization, the attorney said. "No," Ruth replied. "The lodge seal is pressed across the last line of the authorization and onto the first purchase entry." Joanna leaned closer. The circular mark overlapped both sections of the page. Ruth continued. "That seal could only have been pressed after the purchases were written." The attorney smiled, which remains consistent with authorization on March 3rd. Ruth shook her head. "The lodge seal broke during the ice storm on March 2nd. I recorded the replacement myself. The new seal has a missing star at the lower edge." She pointed to the impression in the ledger. A small gap appeared beneath the county crest. "This is the replacement seal. It did not exist on March 1st. The whole page was written and stamped after March 2nd, then dated backward. The courtroom went still. Judge Mercer requested the estate's seal records. The county clerk searched the scorch books and found the repair entry. March 4th, not March 2nd. A blacksmith's receipt confirmed it. The authorization page could not have been sealed on the date written. The judge looked at the two signatures again. Joanna remembered the bridge, the bullets, and Vane's confidence that official paper could make any cruelty lawful. Then she saw the second contradiction. "Sir Alistair," she said, "which hand do you write with?" "My right." "Your left wrist was broken last winter?" He nodded. "It still does not bend fully." Joanna turned the ledger around. The false Hawthorne signature slanted upward in the manner of a left-handed writer trying to imitate a right-handed one. The ink dragged where the hand crossed the name. Vane's face changed. Judge Mercer noticed. He ordered Silas Vane to sign his name. Vane refused. The judge warned him. At last Vane took the pen in his left hand. The same upward slant appeared. Corwin Ashe rose suddenly. A deputy blocked the aisle. Ashe looked toward Vane, but the steward would not meet his eyes. Judge Mercer called the county clerk, who had witnessed the closure order. The man approached slowly. Ashe spoke under his breath as the clerk passed. "Remember who secured your position." The clerk stopped. His courage almost failed. He looked at the judge, then at Ashe, then toward Joanna's table where the blackened lodge ledger lay beside a wooden bread token. "The closure order was filed after midnight," he whispered. The attorney objected that the official record showed an earlier hour. The clerk swallowed. "Mr. Ashe ordered me to enter it before noon. He said no one would question a county seal." The judge asked whether money had changed hands. The clerk looked at Ashe once more. Then he told the truth. Ashe had paid him to alter the filing time. Vane had supplied the false signatures. Both agents intended to sell the reserves and loan the proceeds back to the estates at punishing interest. The closure order existed to shut Joanna's public ledger before anyone compared the kitchen numbers with the estate books. The law they had used as a wall now closed around them. Judge Mercer ordered Vane, and Ashe held on charges of fraud, theft of levy funds, falsification of records, bribery, and conspiracy. The hidden stores were placed under temporary joint trusteeship, with every distribution to be recorded publicly at the Boundary Kitchen. The agents were removed in silence. No one cheered until the courthouse doors shut behind them. Then the sound rose from the benches, not triumph over Hawthorne and not triumph over Blackmere, but the exhausted relief of adults who had nearly been taught to hate one another into starvation. Judge Mercer had one matter left. "The disputed ridge remains unresolved," he said. The room quieted again. Hawthorne stood. "So does the kitchen boundary." Edmund rose across the aisle. For a moment, the old feud returned to their faces. Then Sir Alistair placed his survey map on the table and tore it cleanly through the disputed line. Edmund studied him, removed his own map, and did the same. Neither man surrendered the land. Neither man purchased the other. They agreed that the ridge store, the connecting road, and the abandoned kitchen would be held under a permanent covenant for the common survival of both estates. Each side would retain its property, provide agreed shares of grain or fuel, and appoint equal witnesses to the public ledger. The judge asked who would oversee the kitchen. Both landowners looked at Joanna. She shook her head. No single life should hold it together. So the covenant required 6 elected stewards, 3 from Hawthorne and 3 from Blackmere, with Joanna serving only through the first winter and training every one of them to keep the accounts. Outside the courthouse, Gideon handed Matthew half a loaf from the morning batch. Matthew examined it. "Which estate's grain?" "Hawthorne." "And the fuel?" "Blackmere." Matthew broke the loaf again and passed half back. Joanna watched them eat on the courthouse steps while the two torn maps lay inside beneath the judge's hand. Justice had saved the bread, but it had not yet taught either landowner how to sit at the same table. The first winter night after the hearing, Joanna found a loaf hidden beneath Ruth Vale's coat. Ruth had earned her ration. There was bread cooling on every shelf, stew simmering over the iron range, and enough flour recorded on the wall to carry both villages through the week. Still, the older woman had wrapped one small loaf in cloth and tucked it close to her body as though someone might take it before morning. Joanna did not ask her to return it. She added Ruth's name to the ledger, marked the loaf properly, and said, "Keep it near your bed if that helps you sleep." Hunger left the stomach before it left the mind. For weeks, every sharp sound made the kitchen fall silent. A wagon approaching after dark sent Gideon to the west window and Matthew to the east. Ruth counted the flour twice. Some workers hid crusts in their pockets. Joanna herself still checked the northern road before locking the doors, expecting to see another covered wagon or the glow of fire above the ridge. But the doors no longer belonged to one estate. The courthouse covenant was copied in plain language and nailed beside the public ledger. Hawthorne supplied grain according to harvest. Blackmere supplied timber and charcoal according to cutting. Each village chose 3 adult stewards, and no sack entered or loaf left without witnesses from both sides. Joanna trained them patiently. Gideon learned to record fuel without lowering the count when it came from Blackmere. Matthew learned to weigh Hawthorne flour without pressing a thumb against the scale. Ruth kept the central books in large, dark figures that even tired eyes could read. No one was paid for loyalty to an estate. They were paid for honest work. The abandoned kitchen changed slowly. Its roof was repaired with timber from Blackmere and slate purchased through Hawthorne grain sales. The cracked western oven was rebuilt by masons from both villages. The disputed chalk line on the floor faded beneath boots, flour, and wash water until no one could remember exactly where it had been. Yet one division remained. Sir Alastair Hawthorne entered through the west door. Lord Edmund Blackmere entered through the east. They attended every monthly accounting, stood on opposite sides of Joanna's table, approved the figures, and left without sharing so much as a cup of coffee. The workers noticed. Joanna said nothing until the first killing frost silvered the boundary fence. That evening, she baked one large round loaf instead of the usual small rations. She used Hawthorne wheat, Blackmere firewood, salt bought with shared bakery earnings, and a starter maintained by workers from both villages. She placed the loaf in the center of the table. Only 2 chairs remained empty. Sir Alastair arrived first. He looked at the chairs, then at Joanna. "This is not an accounts meeting." "No." Edmund entered from the east and stopped when he saw Hawthorne. "I was told there was urgent business." "There is," Joanna said. "Sit down." Neither man moved. Joanna untied her apron. Her slender shoulders looked more tired than they had during the hearing, but her voice remained steady. "I promised to oversee this kitchen through the first winter. The elected stewards no longer need me to settle every measure. Before I step aside, there is one account still unpaid." Hawthorne's expression hardened. "Name the sum." "It cannot be paid in money." Edmund glanced toward the loaf. "Then what do you expect?" "For once in your lives, I expect both of you to eat bread without asking which man owns it." The room held only the sound of the ovens. Sir Alastair looked toward the western door. Edmund looked toward the eastern one. Neither wished to be the first to yield. Then Ruth came from the storeroom carrying the loaf she had once hidden beneath her coat. It had gone hard as wood, but she had kept it as a reminder. She placed it beside the fresh bread. "This was the first loaf I believed might be my last," she said. "I no longer sleep with bread under my pillow. I would prefer not to begin again, because 2 gentlemen cannot sit." She walked away before either could answer. Hawthorne pulled out one chair. Edmund took the other. Joanna cut the new loaf into 3 portions. No speeches followed. No apology could repair generations of burned fences, blocked roads, and grievances taught as inheritance. But Hawthorne passed Edmund the butter crock without being asked. Edmund poured Hawthorne's coffee when the older man's cup was empty. It was not friendship. It was a beginning strong enough to survive without pretending the past had never happened. By spring, the shared bakery had produced more than emergency bread. Workers sold preserved fruit, oat cakes, and flour biscuits to wagon companies traveling the county road. The earnings purchased seed for both estates and created a permanent reserve that no steward could hide. Every storehouse key required 2 keepers, one from each village. Neither estate was purchased by the other. Neither surrendered its name. They survived because each possessed what the other lacked and finally admitted it. Joanna refused ownership of the boundary kitchen. Instead, the covenant granted her a small cottage beside it and a lifetime seat at the monthly table, though she rarely used her vote. She said a fair system should not depend upon the goodness of one widow. Years later, travelers no longer called the building the abandoned kitchen. They called it the common oven. During poor seasons, its doors opened before sunrise. During good seasons, the ovens baked extra loaves for distant settlements struck by drought or flood. Ruth taught new bookkeepers that numbers hidden from hungry people were weapons. Gideon and Matthew became the first elected co-chairmen of the kitchen council, arguing over oven temperatures with far more energy than they ever spent arguing over land. Sir Alistair and Lord Edmund never became warm men. But every winter, on the anniversary of the hearing, they entered through the same door. Joanna grew older beside the sound of kneading boards and iron oven doors. Her black widow's dresses faded to gray, then softened with flour at the sleeves. She kept no portrait of herself above the hearth. The only thing she placed there was the wooden bread token Matthew had given Ruth in the courtroom. A loaf burned into scrap wood. A promise made visible. And when Joanna finally left the kitchen council to the people she had trained, the stewards honored her with no statue and no grand title. They built a longer table. It crossed the place where the disputed line had once divided the floor. On its first night, adults from both estates filled every chair. Bread traveled from hand to hand without anyone asking where the grain had grown or whose trees had fed the fire. The story had begun with 4 starving hands crushing the last loaf between them. It ended with 100 open hands passing the next loaf along. And if this story reminded you that survival sometimes begins when proud people finally share what neither can live without, write "share the loaf" in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe for more stories where quiet courage keeps the door open and no one faces the hard season alone.